Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Yesterday, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced the first budget under the third Narendra Modi-led government.
Honourable Speaker, I present the budget for 24-25. Introduction. The people of India have reposed their faith in the government led by Honourable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi and re-elected it for a historic third term under his leadership.
After it was announced, PM Modi said that the budget will empower every section of society and will ensure inclusive growth. He also said that people belonging to the Dalit community and backward classes will benefit from the powerful schemes in this budget, and women's contributions will also be encouraged. But the opposition parties, of course, were critical of the budget. The Congress called it the Save Modi government budget, the Trinamool Congress labelled it as politically biased and anti-poor, and the Samajwadi Party claimed that it overlooked the interest of the youth and farmers. But to understand the budget beyond the political reactions and what it actually means for the economy, we are joined today by the Indian Express's Udit Misra. Udit, firstly, can you explain to our listeners what a union budget is supposed to tell us?
Okay, so, there's a lot of noise around the union budget every year. But very simply put, the union budget is the central government telling the country through the parliament of three things. How much money did it earn? Where did it spend it? And did it have to borrow money to meet its expenses? And if so, how much? Now, typically for any particular budget, it tells what happened last financial year and also gives a projection for the current or the next financial year. So this budget, which is coming in the middle of the financial year, is going to tell us all the details for the projections for the current financial year and also tells us all the details of the previous financial year, which ended in March. That's very simply put. But there is a difference between a union government's budget and a household's budget. It's not exactly the same. Because the difference is that union budget can change the course of a country's economy. It can manage the economy, give it different turns, shape its course. And that is where the budget's importance comes in, because budget can, in terms of how the government spends its money, who it taxes, how much it taxes, it can shape everything differently.
And this was the seventh consecutive time that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman was presenting the budget. Tell us what makes this budget different from the previous ones we have seen under the Modi-led government.
So there was a unique bit about the past two terms under Prime Minister Modi. The government in 2014 and the government that came into power in 2019 were single-party majorities. So while they were called NDA governments, as many of the listeners might recall, they were often called Modi Sarkars, right? Because essentially Prime Minister Modi was the numero uno within BJP, and BJP on its own had 272 seats, which is what you need for a simple majority in Lok Sabha. And budget or any such money bill essentially requires your 272 majority. So for the past two terms, the Modi governments had that unique distinction of being the only government since the economic liberalization in 1991 where they had a complete mandate on what they wanted to decide and how they wanted to chart the nation's economic policies. And we saw that clarity. And there might be all kinds of confusions. And in the past episodes, we've talked about what we agree with the budget and not. But there was a clarity on what the budget was trying to do, whether we agreed with it or not. But this budget is completely different from it and is actually a throwback to the true coalition era budgets where, the budget is in one paragraph trying to assuage a coalition partner, in another paragraph trying to assuage some other section of the society, in the next paragraph is trying to tax somebody, but there is no clear, coherent theme of what it's trying to do, apart from saying, well, it's a holding job, we are here to just survive for one more year or for 5 more years.
Right, and we'll talk about the political compulsions of this budget. But the other difference we saw this time was that the government was acknowledging the distress that has been there in the economy. Distress when it comes to unemployment, but also distress that is there in the rural sector and the agrarian sector.
True. So exactly in keeping in line with the change that has happened as a result of the elections. This government now has a BJP which is considerably short of majority, and it cannot any longer wish away the distress that is there in the economy. So we saw that right through the second term, there was a lot of noise, and towards the fag end of the first term, there was a lot of noise about alarming rates of unemployment, broader economic distress, consumption being low. And we've discussed this in the past episodes that, the government continued to formulate a policy which was completely in denial of what the facts were on the ground. And it argued that its vision would work. And now 5 years down the line, when that hasn't worked, and in particular the fact that, the private sector is not investing and such things, it has had to, in light of the election result, accept and acknowledge that there is unemployment related stress, there is skilling problems, unemployability issues are there, people's incomes have been affected, and that's why you're seeing a whole set of measures which may not necessarily solve everything, but they do openly accept, and the finance minister openly accepts it. The economic survey that came out on Monday also accepted it, that there are data problems in the economy, that there is stress in the economy. And that's something that I think a lot of people are grateful for, that at least some basic facts are being established.
And when we talk about unemployment, the government basically has announced 3 employment-linked incentive schemes in the union budget. Can you talk about what these are and what they aim to do?
Yeah, so simply put, there are 3 schemes that the government has launched, which essentially are based on employment-linked incentives, where the government is saying that we will pay some kind of financial assistance to both the person who's got a job and to the person who's employing the new first-timer, some kind of financial assistance for having entered into this contract. Now, there are different versions of what different schemes are. There is one for first-timers, one for manufacturing, and another one that supports employers. But at the heart of it is this notion that this acknowledgement that job creation has stalled or growth is happening, because on paper, our GDP continues to grow at 8% or 9% or thereabout, and we keep surprising ourselves. But job creation is not happening, and that there's something fundamentally inadequate in the growth mix. So government is trying to make it easy, just assist people who are getting into jobs. Again, there is an element of trying to help them with income, and also to help employers nudge them along, incentivize, encourage them to get newer people. You must remember that for any business, there is a choice to either employ a person or just pay more to the existing one, or worse still, just get new technology. And this is something in the world where we have AI, this is a massive concern. An economic survey, actually the chief economic advisor openly said that in the short term, there is a very good chance that AI will lead to some job losses.
Right, and in this regard, the government has talked about a scheme to provide internship opportunities to 1 crore youth in 500 top companies over 5 years. A scheme which will incentivize additional employment in the manufacturing sector, and another scheme under which 20 lakh youth will be skilled over 5-year periods. And just talking about the political reactions a bit, the Congress party was quick to draw parallels between this and their manifesto, which had promised a right to apprenticeship programs and had promised to create a new employment-linked incentive scheme for corporates. But Udit, at a time when we are talking about a massive unemployment problem in the country, to what extent are these measures expected to help?
Yeah, so frankly, unrealistic to imagine that the government could just by, one scheme or one move solve India's unemployment problem. Listeners should understand that India's unemployment problem is not just about high levels of unemployment, but we are talking about scale. We are talking about a lot of people. So even providing some kind of financial assistance is not terribly easy or sort of easy to fund because there are so many people. When we talk about numbers, the economic survey has said that each year 8 million people need to be given a job over the next 12 years for India to sort of deal with its so-called youth bulge that is happening, right? Where you have a lot of people in the youthful age groups. And in India, unemployment rises its highest point in youth, and it rises with educational attainment. So if you are part of a cohort of PhD holders, then you are facing a much higher level of unemployment rate than a cohort of, say, people who have passed only class 8th. So the point is both scale and the depth, the severity of it. Even unemployability, which is about skilling, even the economic survey notes that, half the people are unemployable. These are people who are educated, but they are unemployable. So it is not possible that at the scale, India is now the largest population on the planet. I mean, the country with the highest population. So it's not easy to do this in one policy. And that is why the government is still very clear. The solutions are not with the government in terms of saying that we will provide everybody a job. They are still trying to incentivize the private sector to come forward, because there is no way, while the government can do more in public sector employment, but there is no way that anybody can argue that the government can simply absorb everybody and solve the problem overnight.
Now, when talking about acknowledging distresses, the other thing this budget does is address the problem in the agrarian and the rural sector. Now, this is again something that the government had been denying, and many had accused it of being more consumer focused. But this problem was something that the economic survey talked about, which is the most authoritative and comprehensive analysis of the economy from within the union government. So tell us, in what way does the budget address this stress, and what are the things that it is proposing?
So the main thing it does is that in the priorities, the 9 priorities that the finance minister lists, agrarian or agriculture is the top priority. So the first thing it does is that it at least says that we acknowledge that, okay, this requires some kind of an attention. Now, opinion is divided whether what the budget says is enough or not. The first priority is increasing productivity and resilience in agriculture. But for the most part, the ideas that are given in the budget, like sort of transforming agricultural research or promoting natural farming or, having a mission mode for boosting pulses and oilseeds productivity or output, because these are things that we tend to import in huge quantities. These are things that have been said again and again. I think almost every 5 years, one finance minister or the other will bring out something on pulses or oilseeds, because it doesn't seem to be working. And there are a lot of very structural problems in Indian agriculture that cannot just be wished away by saying that we'll promote natural farming, because it's a complicated thing. Why do farmers use more chemical fertilizers is an incentives issue. Why do they do that? Why don't they do it? And so changing that will not just happen because the government wants to have more natural farming. The incentive structure overall will have to change. So while it is good that they have acknowledged that this is a top priority, and it is quite ironic that as the 5th largest economy in the world and going to be the 3rd largest economy in the world, India is now keeping agriculture as its top priority when we were essentially an agrarian country 8 years ago. So, we're sort of coming a full circle where most countries through development stage move away from agriculture. We are now focusing on agriculture. Even the economic survey yesterday said that, can agriculture be our savior? I don't remember any time, even going back to my student days, have I ever heard anybody saying that agriculture could be our savior.
Right. In fact, the whole idea has been that India should become a manufacturing hub.
Exactly. Move away from agriculture, because there's just too many in agriculture for agriculture to actually provide for incomes for that. But agriculture doesn't provide as much productivity or income for so many people to live off it. While improvements can be made in agriculture and can become far more productive, and allied industries can be there, but to imagine that a country as big as India, with as many people, as high a proportion still dependent on agriculture, that agriculture would be able to pay for such a large population, would be stretching the argument. So both in terms of what the budget tries to suggest in terms of concrete ideas, and more broadly speaking, this may show more a picture of what the problem is than the solution, that we are thinking about agriculture as our savior.
And the other area that has faced a lot of stress is the MSME sector. Small and medium businesses have faced a lot of issues going all the way back to demonetization. Now, one of the things that has been announced is an increase in the limit of mudra loans from 10 lakh to 20 lakh rupees, and the introduction of a new assessment model for MSME credit. Tell us, in what way is this expected to help this sector?
So again, this is a massive shift. In all of the last 10 years, we found that MSMEs, for a variety of reasons, really got a lot of hard time, whether it be shocks like the demonetization or the COVID pandemic and the induced lockdowns, or policy shifts like GST or going to digital. Many of these things made it much more difficult for MSMEs to survive. And MSMEs basically are small businesses in India. Most of the policy focus of the government was always on big business and hoping to create national champions which will drag large parts of India into more productive things. But MSMEs, India is not just all urban areas, it's also rural, semi-urban areas. MSMEs dominate many of those spaces. They provide jobs to over 11 crore people. And these are small enterprises mostly, and yet collectively provide almost 30% of India's GDP. Now, in many previous episodes, previous budget analysis, we have always said that the government's approach is not to promote labor-intensive industries. But a stark contrast in this budget is that when they have given priority to manufacturing and services, but within manufacturing and services, all the talk is only about MSMEs. And again, while this is a good recognition, the solutions that they have given, like the Mudra loan that you talked about, or say the credit guarantees that they've given, are essentially loans. These are things that they gave during the COVID pandemic. So they're just boosting, sort of putting another layer of that kind of a policy solution. But it only shows that they also recognize that there is a massive distress in this sector. And since the government doesn't have endless money, it's basically saying, we'll give you some kind of a credit guarantee. If you go to ask for a loan, we'll sort of be your, guarantee. Or we'll provide you some loans if you want loans. A lot of people, even during the COVID time, had questioned whether a person who's completely wrecked out of business wants another loan or wants something to survive, to pass a tough phase.
Right, because the problem that people have had for a while is that their incomes have been terribly low. They don't have enough money to spend.
Exactly. So, more loans can just leave them fairly more indebted. They're already eating into their savings because the previous periods have not been very remunerative. And if you then throw a lifeline which is in the form of a loan, well, it's sort of a toss-up whether they would want to take it or not. They may still take it, but that will still leave them fairly indebted. So could there have been other solutions, more direct help? Possibly, if the government had perhaps more money or had a clearer idea. But at least we know that for the first time we are hearing that the focus has shifted to labor-intensive manufacturing. To small businesses have become the big concern, as against saying that we'll give big companies a corporate tax cut and hope that will work out, because that hasn't really worked in the 5 years.
Right, and now talking about the political compulsions of this budget, the government has taken into account its key alliance partners, TDP from Andhra Pradesh and JDU from Bihar. And so in that regard, it has announced a special package of 15,000 crore rupees for Andhra Pradesh, which would be key to developing Amravati, the state's capital city and Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu's dream project. And for Bihar, the centre has earmarked 26,000 crore rupees for various road projects in the state. So could you talk about the compulsions that governments face in a coalition? Can you put that into context?
Yeah, so very simple thing is that even the budget is a money bill. You cannot pass it without you having a 272 seat majority in the Lok Sabha. And basically any such bill, if it falls, the government should resign, because that shows that the House doesn't have confidence. So it's at the heart of our parliamentary form of democracy, where the executive is part of legislature and responsible to the legislature, where it has to show the numbers every time it comes up with a policy. So there is no way but for the BJP to listen to the allies. And that part is hard political reality, which cannot be ignored neither today nor anytime in the future.
And do you think this is unfair to the other states? Because technically a budget presented by the government is not supposed to favor one state over the other, right?
That is true. That is entirely true. Of course, a case can always be made that some states require some kind of attention one time or the other. And frankly, this is a cycle. Different partners might be helping other people and might be getting some benefits. But yeah, it's very genuine that, say, Madhya Pradesh might wonder that if they've given 100% seats to BJP, may feel hard done by, whereas Andhra Pradesh is now being counted as Eastern India just to benefit in a scheme. So,
okay, and we were talking about people's incomes being low. So in a bid to provide surplus money at the hands of the middle class, the government has announced some tax cuts. It has made an increase in the standard deduction to 75,000 rupees from 50,000 rupees, and also marginally tweaked the tax slabs under the simplified new tax regime. Now, this is supposed to provide tax benefits of up to 17,500 rupees per year to individual taxpayers under the new tax regime. So could you talk about this change a bit?
Yeah, so I mean, there has been, the broader argument has been that the private sector did not invest much, even though it got tax break, because the consumption levels in India were low. The consumption levels in India were low because India's economy was slowing down even before the pandemic. We grew at less than 4% in the year before pandemic. Then the pandemic happened, we contracted and since then we have grown in a very artificial manner fairly fast, but that is partly because of a very low base for 2 years. 1 year at less than 4% and then a contraction. So you had a sort of an artificially high jump. But in, say, the last financial year, the overall broader GDP grew by more than 8%, at 8.2%. Personal consumption grew at 4%. Now, why is that? Because people just do not have enough money in their hands. The purchasing power is low. Whatever dry powder they had, whatever savings they had, was spent during the COVID time. So consumption sustained itself. I mean, because there's only so far that you can cut on consumption, even when your income goes completely zero, because you cut into your savings. And now has come to a point where consumption is really struggling. And this is a tacit or less than tacit acceptance, very open acceptance, that we have to give some money back to the people. We have to give some purchasing power to the people. Whether 17,500, which is the maximum that one can get out of these tax changes from personal income tax, is enough or not, that's a different matter. It would totally depend on who's getting how much. I mean, not everybody would be getting 17,500, and those who are getting 17,500 might be are earning more than 15 lakhs. So, well, how much does 17,500 matter for them? So that's a separate question. But the fact is that this only goes on to underscore the broader point that consumption was weak and the government wants you to have more money, because otherwise the whole jigsaw is not moving.
Right, so the idea is that once people have more money, they will spend more money, and that will boost the economy.
Exactly.
Okay, and the other thing that is being talked about a lot is the long-term capital gains tax that the government has announced. Can you tell us what that is?
So many of us invest in mutual funds, and typically if we hold our investments, do not redeem them for 1 year, then the gains that we get, the tax applied to it is called long-term capital gains. These are capital gains, and more than 1 year is considered long-term capital gains. Similarly, if you redeem them within a year, then short-term capital gains are applied, which is a higher rate. But the reason why this is done, obviously it's a revenue source for the government, and it sort of, if you keep the long-term capital gains lower, the tax rate lower than the short-term capital gains, you incentivize people to keep money in the market for longer. So the difference between the short and long-term capital gains, and that has increased this time, is further making a case that stay invested in the market, do not pull the money out. As many people wondering that markets have reached a sort of a historic high, trying to redeem. So if they're doing that, government will get a cut out of it. But otherwise, it's incentivizing you to just stay put in the market and stay there for a longer period. That allows companies in which you have invested to have that capital for longer to do something about it.
And Udit, besides this, the government has also talked about abolishing the angel tax and reducing the corporate tax rate on foreign companies. Now, this is still the government trying to encourage the private sector to invest more, right?
Yeah, that part is the angel tax, and those taxes are essentially about making sure more people come and invest in our entrepreneurs. This has been a absolutely certain dedication with the government that it wants to have more entrepreneurs in the country, wants to make it easier for them to function. And angel tax was sort of a tax on anybody trying to provide this kind of entrepreneurship or backing to such an entrepreneur class. And so that helps matters, gets more investment into India.
Okay, and the other thing that we had noted in the interim budget in February was that the fiscal deficit, which is the extent to which the government borrows money, was contained. And this is something that we have seen this time as well. The government cut the fiscal deficit target to 4.9% of the GDP from 5.1% in the interim budget. Can you tell us why that is considered to be a good thing?
Right. So, I mean, as I wrote in one of the pieces where I quoted Margaret Thatcher, who was a conservative British Prime Minister, when we talk about government finances, these are government finances only in name. Essentially, these are taxpayer money. So when we say that government has to borrow to meet the gap between expenses and income, essentially it is the taxpayer's burden. I don't say everybody's burden because ultimately it's a taxpayer who bears that burden. Now, we all pay certain taxes through indirect taxes, but it will come also down to the direct tax, either corporate or income tax. So higher borrowings essentially mean that there is no free lunch, and if the government is borrowing more, it adds to the government's debt, and sooner or later, either the present taxpayers or future taxpayers, somebody will have to pay that bill. There is no way you can simply wish that away. If the government was to sort of quietly go into another room and print more money and just use that in the market, then that would lead to inflation, which also in another way is basically a tax.
Okay, but if the government reduces its borrowing, it will also likely spend less on things that it is supposed to. Is that a concern?
So the original framework was that the fiscal deficit could be 3%. And for a developing country, fiscal deficit is not necessarily a bad thing. If the government of a developing country always says we'll only spend what we have, then how is it any different from, say, a household? And how can it sort of go beyond? I mean, many of us use credit cards to get over a tough phase. So as long as you pay it back within the set portion or set date, if you let it grow, then it becomes a problem. So fiscal deficit was always considered to be prudential until it was within a certain limit. That limit was set as 3% of GDP. And the hope was that 3% of GDP would go all towards capital expenditure. And to do that, you wanted revenue deficit to be zero. So the original FRBM targets were that revenue deficit should be 0%, which means that for daily expenses, you do not borrow. And then fiscal deficit is still 3%. So what are you borrowing for? You're borrowing for capital expenditure. And that was considered okay because capital expenditure gives massive returns. You are spending money on making a bridge. You're spending money on building ports, airports, roads. All of that will increase economic activity, and you will collect tax through different sources. People will be making money through direct or indirect taxes. You will collect money. So the returns to the economy would be huge. So that was the idea in fiscal deficit. Now, but if you sort of do not rein that in, often what happens, as currently is the case, 4.9% is not all spent on capital expenditure, right? A lot of it is also about subsidies. And this number actually went up quite high during the COVID pandemic and all the help that the government was trying to do through subsidies. And we've been trying to pull it back within a prudential norm. It also has to be understood that when government borrows too much from the market, then it leaves less in the market available for people like you and me and other businesses to borrow. If suppose tomorrow you wanted to start a startup and went to the market and found that the government has borrowed a lot of money, and as a result there's less money, and as a result you are going to pay higher interest rates, you will immediately say, why is my government borrowing for useless things? Why can't it stop borrowing so that I get money at a lower rate of return and I can do something more productive?
So what you're saying is that when the government decides to borrow less money, it is doing that because it wants that money to be there for others to borrow. And plus it doesn't want to spend money on subsidies and instead wants to spend on capital expenditure.
Yes, it wants to prioritize. So one thing that is salutary about this government is that it has tried to switch as much as possible from revenue expenditure to capital expenditure. If you are spending 100 rupees how much of that is revenue and how much of that is capital. And typically, these capital expenditure as a percentage of the total expenditure was very low, less than 10%. So they've been pushing it up, and that's a good thing. And over time, hopefully it will keep going up.
And Udit, towards the end of our budget conversation, we ask you about health and education, two areas where traditionally India's spending has been abysmal. Have we seen any change in that regard this time?
No, we have not. And I think this is a perennial problem. And just to look at this year's numbers, we are the government is projected to spend 1,25,026,000 crores on education and another 89,000 on health. And if you add both of them, it'll be roughly just above 2 lakh crores. And just the food subsidy bill is over 2 lakh crores. So, which is to say that India's expenditure on education and health, roughly put together on one hand, is equal to the food subsidy that we give on the other. The way out typically is either we are willing to sort of take a cut on other issues like defense. Pakistan is a good example. They keep spending on defense, and their whole country has now become sort of a hostage. Their health, education, everything has become a hostage to the defense budget. Many people say it's not a country which has an army, it is an army which has a country. So until unless we take care of this, there is no way we will become the kind of giant, the economic giant that we want to be. We, again, saying it again here, we have the largest pool of malnourished children, stunted and wasted children in the world. These are problems that cannot be solved by having almonds at 25 years of age. You have to solve them before the kids turn 5. So mother's health, infant health, under 5 child health, these are critical things. And education. As we said, unemployment is intrinsically linked with unemployability. Skilling is a massive issue. So either you can spend all this money when they turn 25 and then try to skill them, or educate them better. For example, can we prepare our people better for AI? The future world will have AI as a central thing. So where is that AI in our education curriculum?
And Udit, now looking back and seeing what this government has reacted to, the kind of compulsions it has considered, and what it has finally acknowledged, what would you say is the upshot for you?
Well, I think the first big upshot, is that the government has been jolted, literally, into acknowledging the facts on the ground. I think for the longest time, we've been writing and talking about it that, government is just not, they basically are living in denial. And because they had a brute majority, they could get away with it because they would not give interviews, they would not let anybody ask questions. There were too many strangleholds. The election has allowed for that space to be created where more questions can be asked of the government, their own allies can ask, and the seats that they have lost. I mean, BJP lost 60 seats out of its 300. That's 1/5 of their seats. That's no meager decline. So all those seats have gone to other people who are now making all those points in the parliament. And that makes a big difference because people get to know that it's not just as one government is saying or one man is saying that everything is okay. There are genuine problems and people are complaining about it. If unless something is made visible and can be talked about it, nobody will rectify it. Why would there be? There is no pressure. But now that there is an open acceptance that there is this problem, this government cannot now turn around and say next year that, oh, by the way, we solved everything in agriculture and MSME and employment and skilling last year itself. Because none of these problems are going to go away in a hurry. They required sustained attention, sustained effort. So hopefully we'll revisit them next year in the budget and find more innovative solutions for them. But at least not live in denial. That, I think, is the biggest takeaway for me.
So acceptance is the first step to solving the problem.
Absolutely.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.